A terrifying morning in America. Shocking discovery in Trang Village. Some memories hit you so hard that even the smallest detail, the texture of your pajama shirt, the low hum of your neighbor's mower, stays with you forever. That's exactly how I remember the summer morning when everything in Trang Village changed. To most people, our patch of Nebraska was as dull and predictable as sliced bread. White wooden houses with porches that creaked in the wind, fences tangled with wild roses, and nothing but the rhythm of daily life holding it all together. But sometimes evil sneaks in exactly when nobody expects it. That day started like any other. The sun was just warming up, melting away the gauzy morning mist. I was standing at my kitchen sink, the coffee just brewing, when old Steve called me. Steve's the kind of neighbor you never lock your door against, not because Trang is the safest place on earth, but because he's harmless, the type to bring tomatoes over for no reason and chat about squirrel traps. He sounded shaken, almost out of breath. "You need to come over," he said. "Something's happened at the Jacksons' place. There's blood, Liz. There's blood everywhere." The Jacksons lived in the most unassuming house on Main Street. Emily Jackson, a single mom who worked double shifts waiting tables at the diner, her 8-year-old son Billy, who never stopped fidgeting, and Grandma Helen, who seemed made of stubbornness and peppermint sticks. The three of them formed one of those invisible glue families that hold tiny towns together. Nobody ever had a bad word to say about the Jacksons. "You could set your watch by Emily's comings and goings." I grabbed my keys and rushed out. Main Street looked as sleepy as ever, but as I turned toward the Jacksons, something was different. Steve was waiting by the mailbox, his face the color of skim milk, eyes darting everywhere except toward the house itself. Even I could feel it, the quiet, stifling air, something wrong humming in the background. Steve pointed. Dry streaks of blood ran along the cracked cement outside the porch, some splattered up onto the white railing. He started to walk with me but stopped short at the front door, his hands shaking. "Can you check inside?" he whispered. "I can't. I can't." Inside the house, nothing moved. The place smelled oddly metallic, heavy, like old coins. The living room was a disaster, couch cushions flung aside, magazines torn, framed photos askew. My heart banged against my ribs. With each step, dread climbed higher up my throat. I found them there. Emily was slumped by the coffee table, her hands twisted, her hair tumbled wild. Billy, little Billy, lay sprawled nearby with blank eyes staring at the ceiling, not a trace of life left. Back in the small bedroom, Helen, her face caught in an expression I will never be able to forget. I staggered outside, barely holding it together, and Steve was already on the phone with 911, his voice rising and cracking as he tried to explain what we had found. Within minutes, sirens cut through the hush like a blade. Police tape went up, blocking gawkers and well-meaning looky-loos from getting close. Even the officers who arrived looked stunned, the kind of shock you can't unsee. 2 paramedics, faces set in professional masks, heads shaking ever so slightly, coming in and out in a choreographed dance between horror and duty. The air was noisy now, radios crackling, officers murmuring, a low thrum of constant activity. The first big question was simple. Who could do this to the Jacksons? There are murders you expect, even in a quiet town, a drug deal gone sideways, a bar fight turning ugly. This was different. There'd been no gunshots, no screaming reported. The night before, folks on both sides of the street heard nothing but the thunderstorm that rolled in from the west. Emily's Chevy was still parked in the drive. Billy's battered red bike rested against the fence, one tire flat. When the detectives began their sweep, new questions popped up with every sticky footprint. Why was there so much blood in the hallway and kitchen, but almost none on the old floral carpet in the living room? Why had someone yanked the kitchen cabinets open, yet not touched Emily's paycheck still on the counter? A neighbor swore he saw a figure walking along the edge of the property around midnight, but couldn't say much beyond somebody in a dark jacket. Reporters started trickling in after word got out. A pair from the local Argus Leader first, then a TV crew from Omaha. The national attention felt surreal. They quizzed locals about grudges and secrets, looking to weave tiny threads of gossip into something dark and dramatic for the evening news. But here's the truth. In Trang Village, everyone knows too much and not enough. People whispered about wronged lovers, jealous ex-coworkers, random drifters. None of the theories made sense. Emily was generous to a fault. Helen never left the porch except for church, and Billy barely knew the concept of enemy. That morning, before the police arrived in force, Helen's sister Ginny tried to get past the yellow tape when she heard the news. She sobbed. "Helen was all I had left, shaking so hard I was afraid she'd collapse." The pain radiated out, not just through families, but through every home, every breakfast nook, every set of ears glued to the police scanner that day. We all felt both close and impossibly powerless. The house became a crime scene. It's funny how fast home turns into evidence. Officers cataloged every breadcrumb, each strand of hair, every print on the sticky linoleum. Forensic vans sprayed latex powder, bagged clothing, and swabbed dried blood for DNA. Someone hung a blue sheet over the living room window to shield onlookers from seeing what no one should. By noon, more than 50 people were gathered behind the yellow line. Neighbors, reporters, kids still in pajamas, the curious and the terrified. Nobody went to work. The sheriff called an emergency meeting in the church basement where the pastor led prayers for the Jackson souls, but most people just wept or stared numbly at their shoes. Outside, a hard summer sun bore down, baking the sidewalk, adding to the feeling that time itself was stuck in a terrible loop. Rumors multiplied. Was it a random psycho? A passing hitchhiker? Someone from Emily's past come to settle a grudge? A few began mumbling about money, something about a life insurance payout after the accident that took Emily's husband years before. But then again, the money was still there. Nothing had been stolen, not Emily's modest savings, not Helen's gold wedding bands. It didn't add up. The thing is, when tragedy crashes into a town this small, it doesn't feel real for days. You see the red and blue flashing lights, hear the click of cameras, but a tiny part of your mind keeps whispering. They'll walk out any minute and say it's just a bad dream. But reality pushed in harder and harder as the day wore on. 3 lives gone, lost to a rage or a madness none of us saw coming. We all felt it. Things in Trang Village would never be the same again. The crime scene. Tangled clues and mysterious traces. They say every crime scene tells a story, and that morning in Trang Village, the Jacksons' house spoke in harsh, broken fragments. A story of violence, panic, and a desperate search for sense where there was none. The police sealed off the property almost instantly. Yellow tape fluttered in the prairie breeze while the first responders set about their grim work. The house, at least from the outside, looked painfully normal. White clapboard siding, curtains drawn, an old pickup parked in the gravel. But inside, chaos had buried any trace of the Jacksons' quiet life. Detectives worked methodically, their boots crunching shattered glass and dried petals from a vase knocked to the floor. It was clear from the start that things were far from simple. The living room had been turned upside down, throw pillows scattered, magazines shredded, a family portrait shattered with glass dusting the footsteps around it. Blood patterns traced a gruesome map from the threshold, through the hallway and into the kitchen, then up the stairs, and even onto the back porch. The coroner would later confirm that all 3 victims, Emily, her son Billy, and Helen, had met their end between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., the blackest part of a stormy Nebraska night. Emily and Billy were found in strange positions. Emily lay beside the coffee table, her hands twisted at odd angles, her hair wild as if she'd fought desperately or tried to protect her son. Billy, his small body curled and eyes wide open to the ceiling, seemed almost untouched by violence, except for the red wounds on his throat and chest. Helen was found in her bedroom. The door barely cracked, but the bloodstains and scattered medicine bottles nearby told their own story of a struggle. Curiously, both Emily and Billy were not wearing any clothes when they were found. This disturbed the officers greatly, but also suggested they'd been attacked in their sleep, pulled from bed before they had a chance to react. Investigators collected and catalogued everything. Broken knives, at least 2 blades, snapped mid-blow, were lying near the bodies. These didn't match any utensils in the house. The killer had clearly brought his own tools. Bloodied footprints led in messy spirals around the living room, into the hall, and up the staircase. But their shapes were peculiar. One heavier set, likely a man's, wearing work boots, and a second, lighter set, almost barefoot, probably belonging to Emily or Billy during the frantic scramble for safety. At several points in the house, someone had made an attempt to wipe the floors. Torn paper towels and a mop, stained pink, were found discarded at the foot of the stairs, as if the killer had tried and failed to erase what he'd done. One of the detectives, a veteran named O'Reilly, crouched beside a bloody handprint on the refrigerator, the ridges sharp and desperate. He murmured, "Whoever did this wasn't in here long, but they sure worked hard to cover their tracks." Nothing about the scene spoke of a quick, opportunistic attack. This was calculated, planned, but with an underlying panic that complicated things for the detectives. O'Reilly noticed a peculiar set of muddy imprints by the back door. The soil was heavy and clumped with prairie grass, matching what you'd find in the fields behind the Jackson house. Someone had come in that way, he thought, but the locks on both front and back doors had not been forced. CSI teams dusted every surface for fingerprints and swabbed for trace evidence. The living room's floral carpet, almost untouched by blood, seemed out of place amid the carnage. Why hadn't it been stained, given the violence? In the kitchen, cabinets had been yanked open, but nothing valuable had been taken. A paycheck, cash, even Helen's wedding ring still sat in plain sight. This frustrated rookie officer Sarah Chu, who muttered to her partner, "If this was a robbery, they left behind everything worth stealing. So what the hell were they after?" 2 particularly odd clues stood out. First, a tangle of medical gauze, sticky with blood not matching any of the Jackson family. Lab results, the first to come in days later, ID'd it as male but not a match for any known felon or town resident. Second, beside Emily's outstretched hand, police found a torn shirt, men's size, flannel, smeared with blood, and streaked with a single, muddy handprint. Detectives wondered if the killer had wounded himself during the brutal attack and had abandoned the shirt in haste. The walls themselves seemed to bear witness. Crimson streaks dragged. Along the sherbet paint, photos half torn from their nails. In the hallway, a single sneaker belonging to Billy was found, swamped with blood. Officers mapped a jagged trail from the children's bedroom to the stairs, then to the patio sliding door, following along what must have been Emily or Billy's last desperate run. But the trail just ended at the patio. No sign of the killer breaking through. Perhaps, O'Reilly mused, the perp had climbed back out over the fence, where grass blades now stood bent and muddy in a narrow arc. Not all the clues made sense together. In the bathroom, a towel rack was snapped clean off, but the rest of the room was neat. Someone had tried to tidy up, yet left blood splatter patterns across the ceiling. The killer had spent too much time, yet not enough. He'd erased some prints, but missed the muddy marks in front of the kitchen sink. On the kitchen table, a half-filled glass of milk and a storybook lay abandoned, pages fanning toward a breeze from the open window. No sign of forced entry, yet anyone investigating that morning couldn't shake the feeling that the killer had known the house well, maybe even watched the Jacksons long before acting. Neighbors gathered behind police lines, whispering about anything unusual. Old Steve, still trembling from his first call to 911, told the detectives about a dark figure he'd glimpsed in the alley just after midnight. "Could have sworn he was carrying something heavy," Steve said. "Box or suitcase, I don't know. He looked burdened, like he didn't belong." No one else saw or heard a thing except for the thunderstorm that had echoed through the night. Outside, the family's battered red bicycle rested against the fence, untouched. The old Chevy sat unmoved in the drive. And yet, police dogs, brought in by noon, sniffed a faint trail toward the fields before losing the scent near a dirt road leading out of Trang. This clue left officers convinced that the killer had not been a drifter. He needed both time and confidence to move so quietly through the house, and then disappear. By mid-afternoon, the air in Trang village had turned electric with fear and ruthless speculation. Front lawns were deserted. Mothers watched from living room windows as investigators combed the backyard for discarded weapons or torn fibers. In the far corner of the property, detectives bagged another curious clue: a used latex glove, crumpled and caked with dirt, discarded near the rain gutter. It didn't match anything from the Jackson family. As one officer summed up in her report, "It was a mess of signals, some methodical, others frantic. Too much wiped away, but too many mistakes left behind." The Jacksons' home, once full of life, had become a riddle that pulled the whole town in, one clue at a time. Each new detail only deepened the mystery, drawing a sharp line between what everyone thought they knew about quiet little Trang village and the brutal reality that now haunted its waking hours. Tracking down the killer, suspicious clues, and spiraling theories. If there's one thing small-town America knows how to do, it's to gossip, speculate, and grasp at straws when something shatters the calm. After the shock wore off, Trang village became a living, breathing rumor mill. Who could have done such a thing to the Jackson family? Why? The cops began their methodical grind, piecing together timelines, mapping the footprints, and taking statements from anyone who might have glimpsed something out of place in those black, rainy hours. But as days dragged on, theories began to multiply, like rabbits. The first head-scratcher for investigators was obvious. There was no evidence of robbery. There hadn't been so much as a wallet taken, let alone the little pile of cash on Emily's kitchen counter, or Helen's gold rings still resting on the nightstand. Hadn't even bothered with the electronics. That shifted suspicions from a random break-in to something more personal, more intimate, someone who wasn't concerned about stealing, but about something else entirely. Then came the window. In the north bedroom, Helen's sanctum, the security bars had been cleanly cut with bolt cutters. The job was tidy, almost professional, leaving just enough space for a person to slither through. Detectives fingered the sliced metal, wondering what kind of person would come so equipped. No signs of forced entry anywhere else. The front and back doors were undisturbed. Whoever got in knew what they were doing, how to avoid a racket. The discovery of 2 blood-stained medical gauzes beneath Helen's bed cranked up the mystery a notch. Crime scene techs quickly realized this wasn't from any of the victims. Lab tests showed the blood belonged to a man, but didn't match any known prints or DNA in local or national criminal databases. Did the killer cut himself during the break-in, or while stabbing wildly in the dark? Either way, he left a piece of himself behind. Police and townsfolk both fell into circular debates about a motive. Had Emily made an enemy working those long hours at the diner, or during her brief marriage to Billy's father? Did Helen have enemies, despite her gentle reputation? Everyone came up empty. The family had lived modestly, without scandal, without loud fights or feuds to pick apart. The biggest event in their recent history had been a life insurance payout after Emily's husband died in an accident. But the money hadn't budged from the bank. It was all still there. Next came the tale of the brown motorcycle. Matt, a local who worked odd shifts, reported seeing an unfamiliar rust-brown bike parked on the edge of Main Street in the dead of night. Strange for Trang Village. Even odder, it lacked plates and had a large, battered cardboard box lashed to the rear rack. Security cameras 1.2 miles out caught a brief, grainy glimpse of a skinny young man in a hoodie pulling away around. 12:15 a.m. The bike's rear wobbled, probably weighed down by whatever was in the box. From the timestamp, it lined up almost perfectly with the probable window of the murders. The police pulled up records. There were no reported strangers in the area. Neighbors insisted they'd never seen that motorcycle before, nor the rider. Some speculated it could be a drifter, a migrant worker, or even someone passing through who lost their way. But skeptics were quick to point out how calculated it all seemed. The gloves, the precise window break-in, the mop and effort to clean up after, and now a possible getaway vehicle parked in the shadows. It all felt a touch too organized for mere chance. Rumors, from the church steps to the town's one greasy spoon, flowered into wild theories. A hired killer, a jealous ex, a relative with buried resentment. Some wondered if the crime was the gruesome work of someone obsessed with the family, maybe a stalker no one ever saw. Others muttered about debts or secret affairs, but nothing quite fit. Too much blood, too little motive. The Jacksons weren't hiding from anyone. Back at the station, the investigation circled around the torn flannel shirt found caked with blood near Emily's outstretched hand. Crime lab techs worked overtime to trace the origins. It was men's size, not from the Jackson household, and there was a muddy handprint pressed across the back. Forensics ran the blood and hair samples through every available database. Still nothing. Meanwhile, the discovery of a muddy latex glove behind the rain gutter and a soiled boot print in prairie grass behind the house puzzled detectives. Someone had come across the field and slipped away the same way, careful to avoid leaving tracks on gravel or concrete. The boot tread didn't match any shoes owned by the family. Scent dogs picked up a faint trail across the fields toward the northern dirt road, but lost it near a wide, fast-moving creek. Was the killer picked up by an accomplice, or did he vanish into the cornfields alone? Officers canvassed local hardware stores for recent sales of bolt cutters, gloves, and other tools, running down receipts and security footage. They found nothing concrete. Out here, plenty of handymen kept such supplies. Fingerprints proved an even greater tangle. None at all from the killer. Every surface scrubbed. It was as though he'd melted into the storm. Yet investigators knew. Even the cleverest perpetrator always leaves something behind. Some overlooked trifle. Speculation seemed endless. Was it revenge for a slight so small no one remembered? A tragic case of mistaken identity? A figment born of the painful loneliness that can twist a soul in an empty, wind-lashed prairie town? Every week brought new sightings of the mysterious man on the brown bike, from diner waitresses to bored teenagers. Every report was a dud, but it kept hope alive that the case would soon break. Through it all, the sheriff's department assembled a psychological profile. The suspect was male, thin, late 20s or early 30s, likely local or at least familiar with the area and the Jacksons' routines. He'd planned the crime, a crime of passion, rage, or both, but had nearly botched the cleanup in a panic. Crucially, he had been injured. Somewhere out there, a man nursed a deep slice, a bandaged hand, or a raw gash, the kind not easily ignored or left untreated. In the end, the only certainty for officers and townsfolk alike was that the killer had known the Jacksons well enough to get in, get close, and get away, without anyone the wiser. Each shredded clue pointed to a story more tangled than anyone imagined, and as investigators dug, the community's fear gave way to a more enduring chill. Until this puzzle was solved, no one in Trang Village could truly sleep easy again. New clues surface: the brown motorcycle and the mysterious stranger. The investigation into the Jackson case, until now, had been a frustrating tangle, a string of bloody footprints, a shattered family, and a lingering sense that the killer must have lived among them. But just as the town seemed to be grinding toward hopelessness, a new clue broke through the fog of suspicion: a brown motorcycle and the unknown man who rode it through the dark hours before dawn. It started with Matt, a wiry local who worked nights at the county plant. Matt was always on the road between midnight and morning, and that particular night he was heading home when something off caught his attention. Parked unusually close to the Jacksons' house, facing away from Main Street, was an old motorcycle, a battered brown Suzuki, caked in dust and sporting a cardboard box lashed roughly to the rack. It didn't have a plate, which was odd for Trang Village, where even kids' bikes bore stickers and everyone's trucks were registered twice over. Matt slowed down for a closer look, thought about stopping, but ultimately shook his head and drove home. Didn't want to get in the middle of nothing, he'd tell the police later. Still, the image nagged at him. He'd never seen that bike in town before. The next day, as detectives canvassed the neighborhood, Matt came forward with his story. It spurred a flurry of activity. By early afternoon, police had already pulled every bit of security footage they could from homes and businesses within a 3-mile radius. It wasn't much, just a blurry shot at Bucky's Gas, time-stamped 12:15 a.m., showing a gaunt man, early 30s maybe, in a gray hoodie, wrestling an awkwardly heavy box onto the back of a brown motorcycle. The video was grainy, but the outline matched what Matt had seen. "Could be our guy," remarked Detective O'Reilly, sipping his cooling coffee as he pored over the freeze frame, brow furrowed. The officers scrutinized that single image more than a dozen times, zooming in, consulting with forensics about height estimations, and guessing at motive. Before this, the suspicion had been vague. A stranger, or perhaps someone from town, gone mad with grief or rage. But now, the story began to sharpen. Who was the man on the motorcycle, and what was in that box? More tips trickled in as word of the bike spread. Clara, a school bus driver, recalled almost hitting a scruffy, skinny guy on a motorcycle near the town's edge just after midnight, the bike veering as if overloaded. The description matched the security footage. Deputy Sarah Chu started knocking on doors, asking about anyone new in town, anyone seen at the diner or around the gas station in recent weeks. A clerk at the 24-hour Minimart remembered selling bandages and a bottle of water to a nervous man with a bleeding hand, hours before the killings. The clues accumulated a strange, ragged pattern. The man seemed to have no connection to Trang, no motel check-in records, no receipts, not even a single coffee order at the usually gossip-filled diner. He had arrived under the radar, driven straight to the Jacksons' neighborhood, and left in the same direction, out along the farm roads heading west toward the interstate. And all the while, the brown motorcycle, its box still attached, was the thread that, if followed, might finally unravel everything. Police quickly shared the motorcycle's image and a composite sketch across the county. State troopers, local deputies, and even the press threw their weight behind the search. A rumor began to stir that this wasn't random. Maybe it was a hired hand, or somebody with a vendetta. The townspeople's gossip took on a fever pitch, spinning elaborate possibilities as to the stranger's identity. Was he an old flame of Emily's, a cousin, or just a desperate drifter with an eye for trouble? Detectives reached out to motorcycle clubs throughout Nebraska, sending flyers and photos, hoping someone could ID either the bike or the rider. Most leads fizzled. A handful of grainy photos matched nothing conclusive, and local clubs swore up and down they'd never seen that particular Suzuki before. O'Reilly started working on a theory. The killer had ridden in from out of town and would need help to disappear as quickly as he'd arrived. Maybe he'd stashed the motorcycle and ditched the box somewhere, or perhaps he'd had a friend waiting at the highway turnoff for a fast pickup. At this point, The forensics team put together a timeline anchored on the brown motorcycle's sightings, from Matt's description to the gas station footage to a faint tire track found by the county line. Everything pointed to the same vehicle. One fresh boot print, pressed deep in mud near the Jacksons' back porch, matched the kind seen on the pedals of the bike, size 10, men's work boot, coated with the same prairie soil that covered the Suzuki's wheels. The box on the back of the motorcycle generated as much intrigue as the bike itself. Detectives wondered if it contained the murder weapons. There'd been a missing knife, and none of Emily Jackson's kitchen things matched the fragments found at the scene. Or maybe it was blood-soaked clothing, carefully bundled up and removed to keep investigators spinning. Lab results on the stains from the Minimart's trash bin came back. Traces of blood not included in the Jacksons' family DNA. The implication was chilling. Whoever this stranger was, he'd been careless enough to leave a bandage behind, but shrewd enough to get in and out without a fingerprint. The media ran hard with the motorcycle angle. Local news anchors broadcast sketches of the man and his vehicle every hour. Soon, law enforcement began to get calls from towns 10, 20, even 100 miles away. "I seen that guy at a rest stop," one trucker claimed. "He was filling up, looked right at me, didn't say a word." Another woman in a neighboring town described a man matching the composite wandering the aisles at a hardware store clutching a box of latex gloves. As the narrative built around the bike, so too did the tension in Trang. People double-locked their doors, closed their curtains at sunset, and kept a wary eye on passing strangers, even mail carriers. For the police, though, it all came down to turning the clues into a hard lead. Detective O'Reilly set up a special tip line, sifting through hundreds of emails and voicemails. Most amounted to little, but a truck stop outside Omaha turned up a new lead. A parking lot security camera with a fuzzy image of the brown Suzuki parked for just 20 minutes in the pre-dawn hours after the crime. The timestamp was conclusive. The killer was headed away from Trang, riding fast and alone. As the days slid by, the image of the motorcycle and its mysterious rider fused into a single symbol, the face of the unknown, the phantom haunting the prairie. For those closest to the Jacksons, every new piece of information felt like a thread to cling to, yet also a reminder of how far they still were from answers. Investigators circled back through the Jacksons' lives, retracing old acquaintances, freezing the security footage on the faintest glimpse of a tattoo or a torn backpack. Some wondered about a revenge angle, others about a contract killing, though those close to Emily insisted she didn't have an enemy in the world. As each day passed, the question became more urgent. Why had someone gone through so much trouble, driving in at night, cutting the bars, wearing gloves, cleaning up, taking only enough time to commit horror, and then disappear? The answer, it seemed, lay with the man straddling a brown motorcycle, gloved hands gripping the throttle, carrying secrets in a battered cardboard box. Finally, the break came with a hit in the state DMV's motorcycle database. A serial number captured from the blurry gas station footage proved to have been registered 2 years before to a Tom Lee, 31, last known address, out of state. Police dug into Tom Lee's background, estranged from family, a string of odd jobs, a name that meant nothing to anyone in Trang Village. Yet when Lee's mugshot was flashed to Molly Jackson, Emily's oldest daughter, she turned pale and broke down. Through tears she whispered, "That's him. That's Tom. I knew him. Years ago in Georgia." Decades of detective work across county and state lines converged on the conclusion that the mysterious stranger was not so mysterious after all. Police put out an APB. Suddenly, after days of uncertainty, the investigation had both a face and a motive. The hunt would soon come to an end, but the chill of his presence, the specter of the brown motorcycle, would haunt Trang Village for a long, long time. The manhunt for Tom Lee, broken love, and a plot for revenge. The air in Trang Village had already grown heavy with fear and rumor, but as the investigation took a vital turn and the name Tom Lee started to circulate among law enforcement, the narrative shifted from baffling tragedy to a desperate search for a flesh-and-blood suspect. Piecing Tom's connection to the Jacksons together felt, at first, like assembling a puzzle with missing edges. The fragments of a forgotten romance, the traces of a man drifting through the margins of other people's lives, and, more disturbingly, the methodical steps of someone with a growing, dangerous obsession. The forgotten romance and the unraveling thread. When Molly Jackson, Emily's grown daughter from a previous marriage, first recognized Tom Lee's mugshot, the revelation shocked even seasoned detectives. She hadn't seen Tom in years, not since she left Georgia for community college, and never looked back. Their relationship, Molly explained on record, had always been a point of quiet rebellion for her. Tom was an outsider, a loner with a knack for engines and a restless spirit that sometimes bordered on alarming. They had met when Molly was just entering adulthood, her world expanding, his seeming to close in, and their short romance ended as so many do, fractured by family disapproval, distance, and a fundamental difference in what they wanted out of life. After the split, Tom Lee grew reclusive. He cut off nearly everyone, drifting from job to job, mechanic, short-order cook, gas station attendant, rarely staying long enough for folks to remember his face. Molly hadn't heard from him in more than 3 years. For her and the others, it was like he'd dissolved into thin air. Methodical planning, and flashes of desperation. As evidence mounted, detectives began to see the outlines of a plan that had taken months to form. Motel logs from 3 states showed Tom moving from east to west, always in cash, never using his real last name. In Nebraska, surveillance cameras caught him rolling up to a roadside motel less than a mile from the Jackson home, his battered brown motorcycle weighed down with a cardboard box. Every choice he made, to avoid being seen, to wear gloves, to park in dark lots, suggested calculation. But woven into the method were ripples of desperation. Receipts found later showed Tom bought cheap beer, painkillers, and packets of gauze each time he stopped. Motel clerks recalled a thin, haunted man with a wound on his hand, who barely spoke. Investigators speculated he had injured himself during the stormy night of the murders, perhaps as Emily and Helen fought back. He patched himself up, drank alone, and performed what one detective chillingly described as rituals of avoidance, wiping blood from the motorcycle's grip, burning his old clothes in roadside trash cans. Molly's story and the emotional fallout. On the 4th day of the manhunt, Molly was called in for an extensive interview. She sat across from Detective O'Reilly, voice trembling, and did her best to resurrect old memories, how Tom would send poorly spelled, gloomy letters for weeks after the breakup, how their last argument ended with him sobbing in her front yard, how she once woke to find him sitting on her porch at 3 a.m., pleading for forgiveness. "It wasn't just love he lost," she whispered. "Tom lost all connection. After we broke up, it was like he became invisible even to himself." Her guilt was palpable, but the detectives knew better than to place blame on her. "Molly, you are not responsible for what he did," O'Reilly said calmly, a hand steady on his notebook. "But you're helping us stop him now." The multi-state manhunt. The hunt for Tom Lee moved into high gear with information shared statewide, and then nationwide. Nebraska authorities coordinated with Georgia law enforcement, working from both ends of Tom's abbreviated life. He had left no close family except his mother, who, it turned out, had checked into a tiny roadside motel with Tom 2 nights before the crime, only to check out alone the next morning. Investigators interviewed her at length. She seemed scared and dazed, insisting she never saw the violence coming. All she remembered was Tom's agitation, something boiling under the surface, like shame he couldn't speak about. Federal marshals and highway patrols blanketed the country's rail and bus routes. Roadblocks were established at interstate highways leading away from Trang. Every rest stop and diner along Tom's likely exit paths was canvassed. Social media feeds and missing persons bulletins flashed Tom's picture with urgent, anxious captions. Wanted, considered dangerous. One of the most promising leads came from a mechanic at a service station 120 miles away, who remembered replacing a chain on a mud-caked motorcycle for a jumpy, silent customer matching Tom's description. It was here, detectives concluded, that Tom attempted to swap out a crucial part, hoping perhaps it would keep law enforcement from tracing his escape. Investigators collected prints and swept the area for discarded rags or bloodied bandages. Closing the net, a final confrontation. 6 days after the murders, Tom was found in the gray dawn hours at another small motel, this one on the side of a wind-battered road in western Kansas. He had paid for 3 nights, kept the "Do Not Disturb" sign up all day, and when police battered open the door, was found asleep in his clothes, an empty liquor bottle at his side, his hands still bandaged. At first, Tom denied everything, insisting he was just passing through. But the evidence was overwhelming. The blood-stained gloves recovered from the dumpster outside, receipts for cutting tools and gas, a motorcycle with scraps of flannel, and a single strand of Emily Jackson's hair. In those moments, perhaps realizing his world had finally closed in on him, Tom collapsed into tears. The confession he gave was raw and rambling, a torrent of regret, overwhelming loneliness, and a longing for Molly that had curdled into rage and despair. Aftermath. A community changed forever. The legal process was swift. Tom Lee was extradited to Nebraska, tried and convicted for 3 counts of first-degree murder. But courts and cells did little to erase the scars from what he had done. For Molly, the pain of losing her family was compounded by the knowledge that her past, her love, her mistakes, her choices, had somehow threaded itself into this horror. The townspeople of Trang, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the evil that had visited them with the fading memory of a quiet outsider on an old motorcycle. Neighbors locked their doors at night, mothers called children home before sundown, and for a long while, people whispered Tom's name the way one whispers about ghosts or curses. But even as life in Trang village, slow and stubborn, began to move again, the story of Tom Lee endured. It became a cautionary tale not only about grief, vengeance, and broken love, but also about the deep wounds of neglect and the consequences of failing to see the warning signs until it's much, much too late. Facing the truth, confession, anguish, and late remorse. The interrogation room, the wait for the truth. Tom Lee sat in the harsh fluorescence of the county sheriff's interview room, wrists cuffed to a steel chair. Days had passed since his capture, and the adrenaline that once kept him going had worn off, replaced by a gut-churning emptiness. For the detectives who'd chased him across state lines, it was time for answers. But everyone in that room knew that the answers would come, wrapped in pain. After 6 days of relentless manhunt, the chase was over. What was left was the reckoning. Detective O'Reilly pulled out a thick folder. Police reports, evidence photos, a crumpled flannel shirt, placing it calmly in plain view. Every so often, Tom's gaze flickered to the images. The Jacksons' smiling faces, a lock of Emily's hair, a muddy boot print preserved on glossy paper. The silence stretched, heavy. O'Reilly studied the broken man before him, a face pale and gaunt, fingers trembling, a crude bandage still visible where Tom had tried, pathetically, to patch himself up. "Tom," O'Reilly said in a voice both gentle and decisive, "we know what happened, but we need to hear it from you." At first, Tom said nothing. He chewed his lower lip, eyes fixed on the table. The ticking wall clock seemed to grow louder with every second. The room was sealed off from the world that had seemed so vast and promising, now shrunken to this rectangle of faded linoleum and truth. Breaking down. Tom's confession. I didn't go there to do what I did." Tom's voice was hoarse, as if he'd forgotten how to speak. "I just wanted to see her. Molly. I wanted to see if she was happy." The words caught in his throat. She was always so close, then so impossibly far. The detectives exchanged a glance, but let him keep speaking. Tom's confession was not linear, but spiraled out in fragments, the way memories sometimes surface only in flashes. He described parking the motorcycle in the alley behind the Jackson house, the box of things he'd dragged across 3 states. Inside had been letters written to Molly years before, little keepsakes, a snapshot, a book, a necklace, objects that had once meant hope, and, eventually, grew bitter. He told investigators how he waited, crouched behind a wooden fence as a storm rolled in, counting the minutes until the last light in the house flickered off. In Tom's mind, he had convinced himself Molly or her family would listen, that maybe fate had led him here for an ending or a new beginning. But as the night deepened and he saw the comfort of other people's lives through rain-streaked glass, something in him ruptured. "I thought if I could just talk to her, make her understand. But I knew as soon as I walked inside, there was no going back." He entered through the bedroom window, the one with cut bars, as police had figured out. After that moment, Tom confessed, the night dissolved into a maddening blur of violence and grief. He remembered the feel of rain still dripping from his hair, the startled screams that cracked the house wide open, his own hands moving with a kind of awful autonomy. "There's a moment," Tom muttered, "when you see everything at once, their faces, the fear, and you realize you're the monster. But it's too late. The questions no one wants answered." Tom's confession solved lingering mysteries, but it did little to comfort those devastated by the tragedy. He described the confusion and chaos, how Emily pleaded for her son and for mercy, how Helen tried to intervene, how in his panic he lashed out at anyone who stood between him and Molly's old life. He admitted to the injuries on his own hands, the bandages left behind, the desperate efforts to mop up evidence with paper towels that dissolved under the blood. He remembered running in circles in the house, confused and terrified, then grabbing whatever he could, his shirt, a handful of gauze, the box with his keepsakes, before fleeing into the fields beyond. Through his tears and stuttering words, Tom never once blamed the Jacksons. He took full responsibility, but struggled to articulate why it happened. The detectives asked about motive, and Tom fumbled over explanations. Longing, loneliness, despair, resentment for a world that kept moving while he was stuck in a memory. "I ruined everything," he repeated again and again, as if saying it would somehow bring the dead back. The toll of remorse. In the days after Tom's confession, news of the brutal truth spread through Trang Village like fresh thunder. Detective O'Reilly and his team briefed Molly and the remaining Jackson family, walking them through the nightmare detail by detail, so there would be no more shadows, no more imagined monsters beyond what Tom had done. Molly sobbed as she listened, her heartbreak a raw wound on a town already battered by loss. Reporters from Omaha and beyond crowded the courthouse steps, demanding what pushed a man to such madness. Psychologists called it a perfect storm of rejection, isolation, and obsession, none of which erased the horror or the pain. At Tom's arraignment, a heavy sense of ritual hung over the proceedings, the gavel pounding. Tom's confession played aloud, his voice quivering over the PA system as every head turned first with anger, then pity, and at last, confusion. Some called for vengeance, others for understanding, but nobody left untouched. For the detectives, Tom's remorse, though genuine, was too little, and too late. Empathy could explain the grief, but not excuse the violence. Detective Chu, who'd spent nights analyzing Tom's letters and failed to find a single note of real threat, wondered aloud if anyone ever truly saw the volcano beneath Tom's quiet exterior. Tom, for his part, made no attempt to excuse himself. In court, given a final chance to speak, he stood shackled and tearful and said simply, "Moving forward, grief and lingering scars." The truth, once exposed, could not reassemble the broken. Life in Trang would limp on, marked by a sense of vulnerability that would never quite leave. Molly moved away. She couldn't bear the looks, the questions, or the burden of knowing her past had collided so violently with her present. The Jacksons' family home was never lived in again, eventually sold at a loss to a developer who, rumor had it, hired a priest to bless every wall. For Tom Lee, the rest of his life would be measured in prison echoes, each day another reminder of what had been lost. Occasionally, journalists tried to reach him for interviews, but Tom never again gave a full statement. His letters to Molly, never mailed, were found neatly stacked in his cell, some apologetic, some desperate, all haunted. The confession closed a case, but it left a community grieving and wiser. Sometimes evil wears the face of the familiar, and sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones quietly lurking in the grief, regret, and obsession of ordinary people. The price of hatred, a cautionary tale and lingering shadows. A village forever changed. Long after the headlines faded and the courtroom lights dimmed, Trang Village bore the slow, silent suffering that tragedies never fail to deliver. The horror that unfolded inside the Jackson home, and the shockwaves of Tom Lee's confession, became scars more haunting than anything left behind at the crime scene. For many, days bled into nights uneasy and weighty, as if the prairie air itself carried memory and sorrow. Before the Jackson murders, Trang had been the sort of place where nobody locked their front doors, where neighborly trust felt woven into the fields of tall corn and wild roses. After, that sense of security was replaced with doubt, a gnawing sense that evil could hide in plain sight or ride quietly into town on a muddy motorcycle. Children were hurried inside before sunset, curtains drawn a little earlier each evening. There was a certain hush at the diner and at church, in the aisles of the hardware store and at bus stops. Old friends clasped hands and prayed for comfort at weekly services, seeking some spiritual balm for wounds that would not close. The ripple of guilt and regret. The Jackson family was shattered beyond repair. Molly, unable to face her own memories and the heavy whispers of the village, packed up what little was left of her old life and moved 3 states away. For her, the pain was doubled. A cruel knowledge that a decision from her past, an affection given and then withdrawn, had unraveled into violence no one could have predicted. Emily and Billy's absence created a silence that rang out louder than any church bell. Helen's empty rocking chair on the porch became a daily reminder to her sister Ginny, and to anyone who passed on Main Street, of the cost of grief and blind spots in even the closest-knit communities. Other families, too, were shaken by second-guessing and what-ifs. Steve, the neighbor who'd found the bloody scene, replayed the morning again and again. He wondered if he should have called sooner, knocked on the Jacksons' door the night before, seen something in Tom's face if they'd ever crossed paths. Some community members fixated on missed signals. Why had nobody noticed the stranger with the wounded hand buying bandages? Could more vigilance, as the sheriff later suggested, have changed the outcome? The echoes of hatred and loneliness. As the months passed, Trang Village struggled to name the root of the evil that had come their way. Was it hatred, madness, heartbreak, or simply a slow, unaddressed loneliness? Psychologists who visited Trang for news interviews described Tom Lee as a man overwhelmed by isolation and resentment. They spoke of the dangers inherent in letting old wounds fester, of how loss can breed jealousies so dark that reason fails. Teachers at Trang Elementary led special assemblies for students, talking gently about sadness, coping, and the importance of reaching out before anger or pain turns self-destructive. Still, rumors fluctuated with the seasons. Some pointed to outsiders as the root of the problem, while others whispered about fate, curses, or divine retribution. A counselor invited by the town council reminded everyone, in a packed meeting at the community center, that monsters are most often made, not born. When people fall through the cracks for long enough, sometimes those cracks become canyons. Lessons that outlast the news. In coffee shops, around kitchen tables, and online, the tragedy became a touchstone, a story parents told their children, sometimes sternly, sometimes with tears. You never know what burdens someone might carry, they'd caution. Always look out for your neighbor. Speak when something seems off. Ask for help if you need it. The town sheriff, shaken but not broken, organized a week of seminars about dealing with grief, mental health awareness, and intervention for families in crisis. Law enforcement, once content to patrol with complacency, began conducting outreach in schools and checking in more frequently on residents who kept to themselves. Molly, though she no longer lived in Trang, wrote a letter that the town pastor read aloud during Sunday service. Her words trembled with guilt, but settled into hope. If sharing our pain means another tragedy is prevented, if facing our loss makes just one lonely person reach out for help, then maybe my family's story can carry meaning beyond the tears. Please, keep looking after each other. The weight of unanswered questions. Time dulled, but did not erase, the questions that hung over Trang. Would Tom Lee have found peace if someone had extended a hand? Could Emily or Helen have been spared by a simple change in routine? Did the town itself, through neglect or denial, play any small part in allowing darkness to grow unseen? Many wrestled with uncomfortable truths, that pain left unspoken can become poison, that hatred grown from isolation can devour, and that tragedies are not always the work of pure wickedness, but sometimes of wounds never tended. Residents learned, slowly and painfully, that forgiveness is not a single act, but a long, halting journey. Some chose to remember only the good, the laughter of Billy racing his battered red bicycle, Helen's peppermint candies, Emily's kindness at the diner. Others, haunted by the sight of yellow tape and blood, turned their backs altogether, leaving Trang for big cities and blank slates. Lingering shadows. As the years rolled on, new families came and went. New children played in fields where the past was just a rumor. But on stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the plains, older villagers might find themselves glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting to see a brown motorcycle slice the darkness once again. For Trang, healing meant honoring the lost, but also holding tight to the lessons carved deep by suffering. It meant building resilient networks of care. It meant neighbors checking up on neighbors even for no reason. It meant believing that even in the face of evil, goodness could be rebuilt. The Jackson murders became something more than just a crime. They became Trang's collective reckoning, a painful proof that hatred, when left to simmer in silence, can destroy not only individuals, but an entire way of life. The caution, for all who listen. The story of Trang was retold for generations, not for shock, but for warning. It became the kind of lesson that outlasts memory, the sort written into the marrow of a place. Listen, parents told their children, voices low. Loneliness and hate are never just someone else's problem. And in that small Nebraska village, the price of that truth, steep, devastating, unforgettable, would never be forgotten.